everybody. Today we're going to be talking about two different variations of the squat, starting with the goblet squat, dumbbell goblet squat. The reason why we are starting with this is because it is the most regressed form of a squat in the progression of all squats. The reason for that being is you can always increase and decrease a lot easier in weight when we are using a dumbbell, especially in the goblet form. We always do goblet squat first because it also puts us in the right position to then learn exactly how the body needs to move in a squat. So before we even start with the weight, we're going to go ahead and talk about just the general form and technique of a squat that we always look for before we get into that weight. That way it'll make a lot more sense when we get there. So we always recommend, whenever you're doing a squat, always find a line to line your feet up with, so that way you know that we're not being asymmetrical with our stance just to begin with. Always work ground up when we're going through a squat, okay? So from there, feet lined up with a line, we want to make sure we're about shoulder width apart. I always take one big tip and cue. If you were to put your hands in your armpits and draw a line all the way down to the ground, that line should be where we line up our feet with, making sure we know we're about that shoulder width apart, okay? So being about the inside of those ankles lined up with that armpit line. From there, we're gonna point those toes ever so slightly, not too much. From there again, we're going to make sure we always engage that core first before we do any movement. And we're going to make sure as well, when we're going through this squat, we are gonna keep our form from head to hips in line, in the sense of I'm not going to dip over the front, and I'm not going to then sink my hips all the way back, right? Making sure that we don't have it play too much at the low hips going forward or backwards again. So from there, engage that core, keep that chest drawn in, making sure we're not puffing that chest too much. From this position then, we're just gonna go through that normal squat, making sure we're bending at the knees and at the hips at the same time. So making sure, again, that we go knees over toes anytime that we squat. Making sure, again, that hips are also involved, so making sure that we sit those hips back towards our heels at the same time. That may sound tricky, and it is tricky. Some people understand that a knees over the toes means past the toes, but that is not the case. Making sure knees go directly over the toes. So it is okay to have that knee go forward as we go through those squats. Okay, so as we go through this again, we're gonna go through the goblet squat. Here, making sure when we go to pick up that weight as well, we're going to lift through a squat as well, okay? So grabbing onto that weight, going through that squat, and somehow managing and forming those hands underneath, okay? That is why it's called a goblet squat, because it looks like a goblet, right? So from here, biggest difference from an unweighted and a goblet squat here, we're going to draw those elbows down into the rib cage, okay? So not towards the dumbbell, but into the rib cage. The reason for that is it just helps us engage that core a little bit more, okay? From here. We are next going to be talking through the next progression, which is the dumbbell heel elevated squat. When we're going through this, the reason why this is the next progression is because we get through a little bit more of a range of motion, and we can use this as a tool for anybody who has less range of motion through the ankle. This is a good tool for you to then use to be able to push through the heels and then work on a little bit more power and a little bit more strength through the legs in the same exact way as someone would maybe do it from the ground. Now, those of us who do have more range of motion, this is a good tool for us to hit a little bit more range of motion than we normally do, because with that ankle a little bit more plantar flexed, we can get actually more flexion through the knee, meaning that we actually have to sit those hips back a little bit more in our stance going through this squat. We're going to line our feet up directly straight instead of slightly pointed out, because we want to make sure that we don't have too much rolling of the feet and the ankles. No, think knees over toes, sit your hips back towards your heels, towards the ground, and allow that chest to come with the rest of your back.